So on the journey, tell me about the journey of the movie. You sat down to watch the movie. Your friend said, "Oh, you should watch this movie." You watched it. Like, tell me about the journey of watching the movie and what parts spoke to you, what parts didn't.
So I actually watched it twice. I watched it once on my own, and then I watched it with my mom. And I think the first time around, there definitely was, I think, obviously it was very striking to actually hear FM speak, because I think that he had such a strong personality and a way with being able to express his ideas in this way that always sort of sounded very like exuberant. I think that was really striking to me, especially that kind of the beginning sequence was really, really interesting. And getting to hear him. And then I think that, my first sort of initial reaction is like, what was so interesting about it is it simultaneously felt like a sci-fi film as well as a documentary. And I think that was, that definitely came through just very, very well. Because there were definitely times where you didn't necessarily know what was real, what was scripted, what was like all of these sort of things. You were like, these, you're dealing with something that kind of balances the real and the surreal at all times. And I think that was the biggest sort of experience that I took away throughout it. And I think at times, sometimes when you're first watching a film, that can feel like a bit frustrating. But as it went on, like, I kind of learned to embrace that uncertainty. And I think it served as like a very, good metaphor for kind of the ideas that FM was posing, is that, like, I'm sure he was sort of faced a lot with this, this sounds way too surreal, none of this could ever be possible, yet his faith was so unwavering and unshaken that you could hear kind of this realism in the way that he presented his ideas. So that was sort of the thing that ended up really resonating with me.
The biggest hurdle in some ways is that, and I think we all have some of this, and it is really interesting to me how some people can sort of, well, let me say what this is. This is that we want things in buckets. We want things to be labeled a certain way. I think just in terms of how our mind works, and I think it's often we want to say, oh, so-and-so is this, or so-and-so is that. I mean, in the case of this movie, like, is this movie a documentary? This movie this? And to me, like, that wasn't, I've always felt like, a work of art is a work of art, and or a story is a story. Does it matter? There are different ways to tell a story that can create an emotion or create a feeling or can have an impact. But does it really matter? And for a lot of people, it does. I mean, to me, as I look at some of the reviews, how people are really turned off because they expected to see something that was conventionally a documentary or conventionally science fiction or conventionally an autobiography or a biographical piece on FM. And they are sort of, when it's not that way, that kind of throws them, and they're like, I hate this, or I don't like that. And I think for some people, they like that. And I wonder if it's, I don't know exactly what that is, because I think we all have some sort of yearning to put things in buckets. This is the real question. And I look at this, and so you'll have to forgive me if I'm being stereotypical, but a little bit. But like, I found that your generation, that's so weird saying that, but yes, your generation, like, has all these definitions. There are lots of different definitions. And I wonder how, well, as you think about them as they relate to you, like, how static are they? Like, how much are they sort of a given, in terms of, I mean, to me, the ones that are most confusing are all the gender ones. Those ones are like, it's like a whole, like, as I speak to my kids and my daughter particularly, my head like explodes, like, with these with the different definitions in terms of our gender and our sexuality. But one, like, if you have a sense for yourself of like how you were able not to be thrown by the fact that it wasn't the one thing, and then as you think about your own definitions or definitions in your I don't want to say generation, but in your life, Like how much of those are sort of fixed and how many of those aren't?
I think that what's interesting is with, you know, at least from my view, and I think from maybe the views of a lot of my peers who are kind of from my generation, I think that like what's interesting is a lot of, even with more language being put to certain things, I think that in a lot of ways things have become more fluid in our generation. And I think gender is a great example, because I think that, you know, even though it sort of feels, probably from the perspective of somebody who didn't grow up 100% with a lot of these different, you know, definitions of gender, when, you know, when my parents were growing up, and even people who are just maybe 15, 20 years older than I am, the definition, first of all, the definition of gender and sex were combined into one. And second of all, you know, the range of gender identity basically was you were either a man or a woman, and you could be either cisgender or transgender, but those were the two choices. Like you were a man, you were a woman, and you could transition from one to the other, and that was what was known at the time. And that to me feels much more boxed in and much more static than what we know to be, you know, what we know now about gender, and how, you know, gender and sex are starting to be viewed as separate things, one being biological and one being social, and sort of these different, you know, this different range of language that we have to talk about gender identity, and kind of under the umbrella of what it means to be non-binary or gender non-conforming. That's a huge, huge, huge umbrella. And so I totally can understand how it can be confusing for many, many people. But it also, to me, I think is the great example of how I definitely feel as if things are becoming less static and more fluid, because it's a weird paradox, but as more definitions are being posed, I definitely think it's actually becoming closer and closer to a lack of need to define oneself.
Well, it's so interesting. I mean, because the first conversations I ever had about this in my life were with FM, you know, and it was in the context of somebody that was at one of his gatherings who wanted to transition, and he was, you know, giving them, I guess, the confidence to do that. And so I'd never even thought about this stuff in this way. It's not that so much like that. That's not just about an acceptance. It's more, I can get my head around that, partly because I had a really interesting person that sort of taught me that, I guess. But it's more that if I put somebody in a bucket that they don't see themselves in, it feels like I've done something wrong, rather than, and that it's not so much like, I get that we are more fluid, and again, even the word fluid is so, it just reminds me of FM so much. I mean, it was all about like we are becoming more fluid, and I, you know, again, somebody who in some ways thrives on that and wants to see that, because stasis is terrible. I mean, stasis is, you know, I mean, well, not as bad as regression, I guess, but it's when I guess maybe I didn't ask the question as directly as I should have, because maybe I hadn't thought about it. And I'm thinking again about conversations with my daughter. It's like, if I get it wrong, like I'm saying, oh, so-and-so is this, or that's what it seems like, it's like I've done something terrible. And so as people redefine themselves, or put themselves, or establish a connection to a particular definition, like how static is that, and why is it, or why does it seem, at least to me, that people seem to get upset? I mean, maybe I go on Twitter too much, and that's where everyone's getting upset. But why does it seem as if the definitions are all important, rather than like cutting people slack? Or maybe I've got it wrong.
I think with I think the important distinction to make is I definitely think that with fluidity, it doesn't necessarily come with a lack of connection to identity. And I think definitely for me, and I can understand why, like I think there will always be a sort of protectiveness of personal identity. And so when that is sort of misconstrued by somebody else, I think that it still does feel very personal and can feel very hurtful. I think, there is a conversation to be had about, this idea of understanding that a lot of this fluidity and a lot of the language that is being put to it is very new. And I do think that, like, there has to be a level of sympathy on both sides for becoming accustomed to that. But I definitely do think that, and maybe this is because this is how we've historically been taught to think when things were a lot more binary. So maybe this is the remnants of that. But I do think that human beings will always have a sort of protectiveness over their personal identity. And it comes from a place of a genuine place of wanting to feel connected to oneself and using these different definitions and using these different labels to express that outwardly. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I do think that moving towards a society with where, the specifics of a label doesn't necessarily matter is something that is important. But I do think that no matter what, human beings will feel a sort of protectiveness over personal identity. And I think that's where that, and again, maybe this sort of construct of life and death and what it redefining what a human life means and what a human life looks like will change that, because I think that there it could also have to do with this pressure of finding authenticity in the 80, 90, 100 years that you have.
This idea of identity, I think, in and of itself is fluid. I mean, this is the inner FM. As you were saying, I was thinking, I wonder what FM would, like, if FM was sitting here, like, what he would say about it. And I think he would say, well, your identity is fluid. He would say, like, today, you may be really comfortable being blah, 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 and, but tomorrow, if you could be, and again, I'm reminded of somebody in this community who's like, well, tomorrow I'm going to be a centaur. I'm going to put wings on. I'm going to be a half horse. I'm going to fly across the planet. Like, and again, when I first heard this, I was like, fucking hell, they're out of their minds, right? But I guess if you really had a choice and you're like, tomorrow I really do, I'm going to put on, the wings of Pegasus and I'm going to fly across the planets. If you really could do that, there's no, apart from it just seems so out there, why not? I mean, and again, that's a really off the wall example, but these examples of, again, look, my own identity has changed. I mean, it hasn't really changed, but like how I feel about certain things, like what was important to me 20 years ago, or even a few weeks ago, is less important now. And sort of like, I guess at the basis is more about how I behave and what that says about who I am. But again, we're really jumping down some heavy philosophical rabbit holes.